In over 2 decades of working with people, one pattern stands out more than almost any other. Driven, high-functioning professionals, people who were genuinely really good at their jobs. They would arrive exhausted and running on caffeine willpower, and in quite a few cases, sleeping tablets, just to get through the week. Not because something was fundamentally wrong with them, but because nobody had really ever explained what their sleep actually needed. Now, in a lot of those cases, obviously working alongside their doctors, we didn't just improve their sleep, we improved everything, their energy, their focus, their resilience. And in several cases, over time, the sleeping tablets became something they needed less and less. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not anti-medication. There are people for whom medication, sleep medication, is genuinely necessary, but lifestyle interventions are almost always worth exploring first, and a lot of people simply haven't been shown how. Now, if that sounds like you or someone you know, this one's for you. The conversation about sleep usually goes something like this, right? 8 hours is good, 6 hours is bad, try to get some more, right? That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. What actually determines how your brain performs the next day isn't just how long you slept. It's what happened during that sleep. The quality, the architecture of it. Whether your brain got the conditions it needed to do something that, when you understand it all, genuinely changes how you think about rest. Because sleep isn't passive. While you're unconscious, your brain is doing some of the most important work it does. So your brain produces metabolic waste throughout the day. It's just a natural consequence of how hard it's working. Neurons are firing, energy's being consumed, and byproducts are building up. One of those byproducts is a protein called amyloid beta. And you might have heard of this in the context of Alzheimer's disease. So during waking hours, this waste accumulates between your brain cells. And unlike the rest of your body, your brain doesn't have a conventional lymphatic system to clear it all out. So it has its own, and it's called the glymphatic system. And it's a network of channels that uses cerebral spinal fluid to flush out that accumulated waste during your sleep. You can think of it as your brain's overnight cleaning crew. It comes in after the building empties, clears out all the debris, all the rubbish, and gets the place ready and set up for tomorrow. Now, during sleep, slow wave sleep, brain cells actually contract slightly, creating more space for that fluid to kind of move through. Now, a 2024 study in Nature Communications provided the first direct human evidence of this, showing that glymphatic clearance during normal sleep significantly improved the removal of amyloid beta and tau proteins compared to sleep deprivation. The science is still developing, but the principle is solid and the implications are hard to ignore. Poor sleep isn't just tiring, it's leaving your brain to operate in an increasingly cluttered environment. And over time, that has consequences well beyond feeling a little bit groggy the next morning. The lymphatic system is only part of it. During sleep, your brain consolidates memory. So moving information from short-term storage into longer-term neural networks. And it's why an all-nighter before an exam is almost always counterproductive. The learning happened, right? But what you cut short was the consolidation. Also, your prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational thinking and emotional regulation, it goes through like an overnight recalibration during deep sleep, which is why everything feels more manageable after a good night's sleep and maybe more overwhelming when you haven't had one. So, when you kind of get out of the wrong side of the bed, as they say, that's not a character flaw, that's neuroscience. And then growth hormone, which matters for tissue repair and cognitive restoration, peaks during deep sleep. Cortisol, which is your primary stress hormone, also follows a circadian rhythm that sleep helps regulate. Now, when sleep is poor, the rhythm shifts and you can end up waking up with cortisol that's already really quite elevated, before your day's even started. So you disrupt the sleep and you disrupt all of this. So if you've ever noticed that decision making, your patience, your productivity or output all seem to fall apart, after a run of poor nights, now you know exactly why. Everything I've just described depends on one underlying system working properly, your circadian rhythm. Every cell in your body runs on an internal clock, synchronized to light and darkness, and it determines when cortisol rises to wake you up and when melatonin rises to start to prepare you for sleep. And for most busy professionals, This system is being quietly disrupted every single day. Bright artificial light in the evening suppresses melatonin and delays the wind down signal your brain needs. And not getting natural light in the morning means the cortisol peak comes kind of later and flatter, which is why so many people feel like they're not fully switching on until mid-morning, no matter how early they get up. Irregular sleep and wake up times compound this even further. Your circadian clock wants consistency and routine. When your bedtime shifts by just a couple of hours across the week, it can never really kind of optimize itself. Exercise timing matters here too, which I think is something that rarely comes up in kind of generic sleep advice. So morning or early afternoon training reinforces your circadian rhythm, giving your body a temperature rise and movement signal at the right time of the day. Training late in the evening can work, and for some people it's the only realistic option that you might have. But if that's you and you're finding it hard to wind down afterwards, you just need to be more kind of diligent and deliberate about recovery before bed. I'll talk about this a little bit more later. Now, something that I suspect is relevant to a number of you guys watching this, and it's something that I rarely hear people really talking about. It's travel. Over the years, I've noticed something fairly consistent. A client returning from a 7-hour flight from New York will often show more cognitive fatigue than someone who's just done a crazy 60-hour work week at their desk. Even a short kind of European trip can noticeably affect performance for a day or two if you don't manage the recovery properly. The reason is that travel doesn't just disrupt your sleep, it disrupts your circadian rhythm at the source. Your light exposure, your meal timing, your activity patterns, all the external cues that your body relies on to keep its internal clock synchronized. All of this can kind of shift by 5 or 6 hours in a single day. Your brain and your body end up running on completely different instructions to the environment around them. Here's the protocol I've built with clients over the years, guided by the research and from watching what's actually working. So first, land and move. Not a massive kind of heroic gym session, just 20-30 minutes of zone 2 or mobility work in the hotel gym, or if the gym isn't that great, the hotel room is fine. The goal is to give your body a movement, light and temperature signal that says, this is the time zone you're in now. Now start adjusting. How hard you train depends entirely on how you feel. If a client messaged me from the airport sounding absolutely knackered, then we dial it right back. Sometimes just a walk and some breathing exercises might work. Adding physical stress to an already overloaded nervous system isn't a great idea. Second is creatine. There's now solid evidence, including a 2024 study in Scientific Reports and then a follow-up research in 2025, that creatine partially offsets the cognitive decline that comes with sleep deprivation. Now, sleep disruption depletes brain energy reserves, and creatine supports the brain's ability to regenerate ATP under that kind of metabolic stress. So during high travel periods, I'd increase intake to around 10 grams per day, slightly before and during the trip, and then maybe for a few days after. And then you can just return to a maintenance dose. Now, I mentioned creatine because it's widely available, well tolerated, and the research specifically backs it during periods of disrupted sleep, which is exactly what long-haul travel creates, right? And third is anti-inflammatory support. So omega-3s, polyphenol-rich foods like berries, dark greens, olive oil, that kind of stuff, and proper hydration. So travel is dehydrating and inflammatory, and your glymphatic system works better in low inflammation states. So I put magnesium in there. It's very useful during high stress and high travel periods for sleep quality and nervous system regulation and recovery. So here's the honest part, right? You're not always going to sleep well. Work runs late, family stuff happens. There are weeks where the routine, it just simply doesn't work. Now, the goal isn't a perfect sleep protocol. It's understanding the biology well enough that when things go wrong, and they will go wrong, you can limit the damage and recover faster than you would have otherwise. One of the tools I use consistently with clients during high stress or high travel periods is HRV monitoring, which is heart rate variability. Now, it measures the variation between heartbeats, and it's one of the most sensitive indicators we have for how recovered your nervous system actually is. When HRV is low, your body is under stress. When it's high, you're recovered, and most decent wearables will give you this. Your Whoop, your Garmin, or whatever one you use, that it should be fine. Now, what I use it for is decision making. So low HRV, we adjust the session. We don't just plow ahead and push on through regardless. If they've got high HRV, everything is on the table, you know. This takes the guesswork out of it and replaces it with actual information. So what I use it for is decision making. So if my client's got low HRV, then we adjust the session. We don't just push on through regardless. If they've got high HRV, everything's on the table. And this takes the guesswork out of it and replaces it with actual information. Now, alongside that, I always just ask one simple question. How do you actually feel right now? You know, alongside that, I always just ask one simple question. How do you actually feel right now? You know, not how do you think you should feel, but how do you honestly feel right now? My clients aren't trying to get out of a tough workout. They understand that if they don't work hard enough when they can, they won't achieve their goals. But if they push too hard, it could backfire. Combining HRV and honest self-assessment tells you where your system is. And once you know that, you can make the right call rather than kind of forcing the wrong thing at the wrong time. Right, now let me give you something concrete to take away from all of this. The single most effective thing you can do for your sleep costs absolutely nothing and takes about 5 minutes. Get natural light within the first hour of waking. You know, outside if possible, or sitting by a window if you have to. This is the primary signal your circadian clock uses to set the day's rhythm. It's simple, it's free, but the majority of people don't do it. And then in the evening, reduce light as much as you can before you approach bedtime. You know, your brain can't tell the difference between light from a TV or a phone and natural daylight. So putting night mode on your devices, using dimmer switches or lamps rather than overhead lighting, just for a couple of hours before bed is really, really useful. And this is a big one. Keep your sleep and wake times as consistent as you possibly can, including on weekends. A couple of hours lying on a Sunday can create something close to like mild jet lag going into Monday. You know, your circadian clock doesn't know it's the weekend. We spoke about this earlier, but if you train in the evening and struggle to wind down afterwards, the issue is your nervous system arousal, not the actual training or the exercise itself. So try some box breathing, a cool shower, keeping the hour after your session as calm and low stimulus as possible. Now, if you have to train at night, that wind down section, it becomes part of the actual gym session. For high travel or high stress periods, creatine at a higher dose, magnesium daily, omega-3s, anti-inflammatory foods as much as you can. These aren't dramatic interventions. They're just kind of supporting the biology at the point where it's most under pressure. And start paying attention to your HRV alongside how you feel, you know, not to obsess over the numbers, but to build an honest picture of your recovery over time. Now, a few weeks of data can give you really, really good insight into how you feel and what works or what's working for you. What I've seen consistently over the years is that when people start genuinely supporting their sleep, not just trying to get more hours, but working with the biology underneath, the improvements spill into absolutely everything, you know, how they think, how they handle pressure, how they show up on the days that actually matter. And the side effects of doing all of this are that people tend to get fitter, stronger and healthier, you know, not too shabby, right? So the next time you have one of those days that just won't come together, you know, where your thinking feels slow, your decisions feel harder than they should, perhaps you're a little bit more snappy than usual, and you can't quite work out why, before you reach for another solution, ask yourself one question. How did you sleep this week? Because the brain you sit down with every morning is largely a product of what happened while you were sleeping the night before. And once you start taking that seriously, not just the hours, but the biology underneath, sleep stops becoming something that gets in the way of your day. It becomes a superpower and one of the most valuable tools you have to help you achieve everything you're trying to work towards. And if you want to go deeper in any of this, you know, the travel protocols, HRV monitoring, how to structure your training and recovery around what your brain actually needs, the newsletter is where I cover this every week. You know, it's practical, evidence-based, it's free. I'll stick a link below. And the Fit Mind community on School is where all the coaching conversations happen. That's also free and I'll link that below too. Have a good day.